Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased to see you today, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar with the Natural Curiosity program. We've been hoping to have them here for a while, and we're thrilled before the end of the school year that they joined us. My name is Hilary Inwood. I am Lead of Environmental and Sustainability Ed at OISE. Soon to be its Sustainability Coordinator. I hear I'm getting a slightly different title, which is great this summer. I think it just speaks to the broadening of the work that we're doing in this field. So I'm very happy about that, but very happy to welcome so many colleagues in the room. I'll introduce you to our two guest speakers, Doug Anderson and Haley Higdon from the Natural Curiosity program shortly. But Rosa Na is in the room from Natural Curiosity as well, who isn't presenting today, but we love working with Rosa. And I'm also very happy always to welcome my colleagues from the TDSB's Eco Schools program. Chris Metropolis is in the room with us today. And I noticed we've got lots of our Eco Schools teachers in the room as well. So it's fantastic to see. So very, very happy to welcome Natural Curiosity as part of this webinar today. I will give thanks right up front to TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, who have helped to provide funding for this OISE series. It's all focused on educational gardening. We've already had one in the series. We'll be having more in the fall on this series. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about educational gardening, and we try to bring as Indigenous presenters in as often as we can, and certainly we're very lucky to have Doug with us today on this front. This is a great way to learning about the land and about being on the land, and certainly all aspects of our connection to decolonization and reconciliation. So this is a really important webinar, and we're really thrilled to be hosting it today. I will, Haley, would you like to do the land acknowledgement first, and then I'll introduce both of you after that? Would that be all right?
Yeah, for sure. So the land acknowledgement that we like to share when we start presentations about natural curiosity is a land acknowledgement that was created and written, as you can see, by the grade 6 students at the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study Laboratory School, which is based out of OISE U of T. And it's a couple years old now, and it does remain a living document. And these students worked with Krista Spence, who was the teacher librarian at the time, and also in partnership with Doug Anderson, as well as a community elder, to rewrite the U of T land acknowledgement, actually, because they worked throughout the year with Krista and with Doug, and as you can see in the land acknowledgement, which I'll read in a moment, to learn about the true history of our country and learn about the impact of colonialism and the impact of residential schools, and as well as learning about ceremony and celebration. And you can see their words, strength of community. And so we want to share their words. They created this land acknowledgement for their grade 6 graduation, knowing that they would have to start with a land acknowledgement, but wanting it to be more meaningful to the learning that they had done throughout the year. So these are their words, and I will read them aloud. This graduation or presentation begins with the land acknowledgement because we will be using the land and need to respect this place where Indigenous people have lived and continue to live. We wrote this to share some of our learning and to teach others. We thought about who would be hearing it, and we didn't want to make it too complicated or too simple. We would like to thank the first peoples of this land and all of creation, including the animals, plants, land, water, air, rocks, trees, and all that exists on this beautiful earth. We honor the Indigenous people whose traditional territories include the land on which we gather today: the Petun, the Wendat, Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and other nations whose names we no longer remember because of the impact of colonialism. We want to honor the treaties that were made with the land and between First Nations and the Crown. Treaties should be honored no matter what political party is in power. The story of Canada that most of us know is not the whole story. We've been learning from Indigenous sources about losing language and culture through residential schools, and also about ceremony, celebration, and strength of community. When we're thinking about doing something to the land, like dams or pipelines, we should ask Indigenous people first, because they lived in balance with nature for thousands of years. We have lost our relationship to the earth by doing things like polluting and taking too much. We need to ask ourselves, what is more important, what I get out of this or what happens to the land? We need to think 7 generations ahead. What we do today, how will that affect tomorrow? We invite you to do the same. So again, beginning with student voice, that is much more powerful than ours.
Thank you, Haley. And I did want the land to be the first thing that's introduced, the first being that's introduced today. And I'd be happy to introduce you now at this point. Thank you so much for leading us through that. Haley Higdon is a guest and settler on Turtle Island, and she is the program director of Natural Curiosity. And I've had the pleasure of working with Haley for a number of years, and we've just finished co-hosting a national conference together. So we certainly got to get to know each other very well as part of that process. She works out of the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study Laboratory School. It's part of OISE at the University of Toronto. She has her B.Ed and M.Ed in Child Study and Education from OISE U of T. She's the managing editor for the development and creation of Natural Curiosity, the 2nd edition, The Importance of Indigenous Perspectives in Children's Environmental Inquiry. And if you haven't picked up that book yet, you need to do that, but we'll talk more about that as the webinar unfolds today. Haley has extensive experience in supporting educators with incorporating environmental inquiry and Indigenous perspectives into their practice. So welcome, Haley, and thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. I would like to introduce our 2nd speaker at the same time, and Doug has also been completely central to the formation of the 2nd edition of Natural Curiosity as well. Doug Anderson is Métis Bunji. His family is originally from Reedy Creek in Minnesota, in Manitoba, and BC, and he grew up in Ontario. He's been the creative and strategic director at Invert Media since 2003, and has consulted on Indigenous education and program development across Canada for over 25 years. Since 2001, he's been devoted to research and writing on Indigenous histories and cultures, translating them to contemporary education systems and media. And since 2010, his focus has been on learning in the land and mostly in the city. He enjoys designing new ethical platforms, for Indigenous knowledge, and is committing to supporting the preservation of these forms of knowledge as models for thinking and problem solving in the 21st century. And Doug has worked both at the government and community levels for many years in development, delivery, and evaluation of learning programs, and has many years of frontline experience in building, learning, and training opportunities for community members of all ages and levels of learning. So Haley and Doug, welcome. So pleased that you're joining us today.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm already going to throw the presentation off a little bit because I have a question for Doug. I didn't actually attend the graduation this year for the grade 6s. I'm wondering, because this is a new group of grade 6s, did they change the land acknowledgement at all?
So they did challenge it. So one of the girls, they're doing this like we all do institutionally now in educational institutions, and basically asked that one of the girls asked the question, well, what are we actually doing? And so, the pandemic, right? There wasn't a lot of opportunity to sit and work with the grade 6s this year on that question, but they are addressing it in their own way. And they're going to bring, their questions are going to be brought forward. So that's the short answer. And one of the things that was challenging when they asked that question was that how can we actually do something for the land or the people here if we're not actually having a relationship with it? And so, at the beginning of the land acknowledgement, it says, we will be using the land today. And we don't really use it. We have in our education systems a way of training people from the get-go to kind of prepare for a 20th century economy. And if you've ever heard of externalities in the field of economics, it's a way of describing all the stuff that economists and politicians don't like to talk about. But those things are the kinds of things that children do ask about because they have the freedom to do so. People my age, generally, we don't have that freedom. We have to sort of stumble through the systems that we've inherited from that are unsustainable. So yeah, using the land is a big thing. And that was one way we were answering that girl's question this year. We were starting to, was to invite them back to up into a process that's going to unfold on the land, in the land, and that actually takes them into questions exploring how they sustain it while they're using it. Because if we're not using it, we're not going to be very inclined to sustain it. Right now, a lot of our environmental activities and a lot of our gardening activities, which are all wonderful, tend to be run through sort of nonprofit models and kind of one-off projects. And there's amazing people doing amazing work, but we're kind of saddled with these silos of kind of funding and environmental focus that aren't attached to other things. So that's kind of the big question she asked was huge, because where we're headed with it is we want to ask how we go out onto the land and start to process what's out there and use it, and then something's at stake. So it's very different from sort of Canadian environmental philosophy, which is how do you keep kind of people off the land and protect it from people. The questions we're asking have more to do with how do we get out there and understand that this is our sustenance and it's how we're going to live, and then how do we sustain. That's a long answer to your question.
Oh, thank you. I was just interested because I knew you were at the graduation, and it's a good extension because it's meant to be a living document, right? And it's meant this was created by the grade 6 students from 2 years ago. So, and it's totally connected to our conversation today. So thanks, Doug.
Yeah.
So just because I'm unsure of how many people are familiar with natural curiosity, this slide, my colleague Rosa is going to pop in a link to a webinar where Krista talks about her process of creating this land acknowledgement with a group of students, if people are interested in learning more about that. Just really quickly about natural curiosity. It was launched in 2011 as a reaction to the ministry document, Acting Today, Shaping Tomorrow, the Ontario ministry document, which says we should be incorporating environmental education into everything that we do. It's that ministry document is still mandated and available. But the first edition of Natural Curiosity was created, and we got lots of positive feedback about that resource, but some of the constructive criticism was that we were missing Indigenous perspectives. And so just quickly going through that, we did some work with Indigenous partners and Indigenous community members around the first edition and talking about environmental inquiry. And they encouraged us to take steps to further bring Indigenous perspectives into the conversation. So whenever we bring this up, we'd like to say Chimigwech to those communities, to the educators from Arrowland First Nation, to the educators from Rainy River District School Board and Seven Generations Educational Institute, who really pushed us to think about what doing something different and acknowledging that there was so much we didn't know and that we needed to learn in this process. So another motivation to bring a greater understanding of Indigenous perspectives into the conversation around environmental education was the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. And also connected to our conversation today around natural curiosity on the land is this quote that reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people cannot happen unless we are also reconciled with the land. So the commission interviewing residential school survivors across the country heard over and over again that if we reconcile our relationships with each other, but continue to destroy the land, then reconciliation remains incomplete. So this is an integral part of this conversation around reconciliation as well. So I wanted to share this picture because once the second edition, so I'm missing a bunch of steps here, but we formed an Indigenous advisory group and they recommended that we hire an Indigenous author. And that's how, well, actually Doug was part of the advisory group. And then we hired Doug to support us in writing this new edition. And I'll speak a little bit, and so will he, about sort of that process. But why this picture is here is because we're talking about natural curiosity on the land. So once this book was completed, we were intentional in launching or beginning the journey of this resource, and lighting a fire and feasting the resource on the land before we did it in an institutional context. So you can see this is a group of people that were involved in the creation of the second edition, spending time on the land, setting our intentions for what this resource could be. And so I just wanted to share that as well, because I think it's important too before we launched it in an institution. And then just before Doug jumps in again, if people have never heard about natural curiosity, I just wanted to talk about the 4-branch framework. So in the first edition of Natural Curiosity, there was a 4-branch framework of inquiry, experiential learning, integrated learning, and stewardship. And you can see those 4 branches are still there. But Doug worked with us to provide a lens on each of those branches to just have a beginning sense of how Indigenous perspectives can inform and support, and also contradict at the same time the ideas that were in those 4 branches. So we start with inquiry and engagement. And Doug has connected that to the idea of a strong sense of spirituality and experiential learning to, and again, this is just like a brief explanation of the framework before we dive in. Experiential learning to a deeply rooted sense of place and being deeply connected to place. Integrated learning to the idea of the flow of knowledge and how, you know, from a Western perspective, I always thought of integration as, you know, how do I integrate subjects? And I've now learned that it's so much bigger than that, that we need to be integrating community, we need to be integrating family, we need to be integrating all our non-human relatives, and also think from a 7-generational perspective when we talk about integration. And then finally, the 4th branch, which we're going to be focusing more on today, is moving towards sustainability, which used to be called stewardship. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's changed. Partially is from a Western perspective, stewardship can imply a hierarchical relationship with the land. And from reading Doug's first drafts, we realized we wanted to change that, to have a greater understanding of how reciprocity is an integral part of this conversation. And we acknowledge that sustainability is still not quite the term that we, or depends on how it's defined, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's sort of a really brief description of the 4-branch pedagogy, as well as the Indigenous lenses placed on that pedagogy, that will sort of frame our conversation today. But focusing on the 4th branch is what we hope to do. And the 4th, I just want to share this last slide before I pass it over to Doug, because there is a lot of research out there that suggests that environmentally committed behavior is most closely associated with 3 things. The first thing is a sense of efficacy in the world, and that is connected to an inquiry approach to learning and this idea of sparking the fire within all of our students. The second thing that research shares about how we create environmentally responsible students is a caring relationship with nature. And that is obviously connected to experiential learning and sending out our roots in place. And then the third thing that is connected to creating or supporting environmentally responsible students is this idea of a solid knowledge about environmental issues and action strategies, which can be connected to integrated learning as well as reciprocity and breathing with the world. But I do want to say that within that, I do think this idea of emphasis on how we create reciprocal relationships is often missing in this conversation. And so that's what we're focusing on today. So this is a quote written by Doug Anderson that I think is so important to the conversation, and then I can pass it along. The greatest questions for our current age have to do with learning through relationship and mutual care. How do we help a community of children and families grow relationships with their local world in their own culturally specific ways, informed through ethical consultation and meaningful partnerships with regional Indigenous peoples wherever possible? How do we help children reclaim the local world as their own family?
Mm. That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm always aware of just how nearly, I don't want to say impossible, but just how difficult it is to convey kind of the fullness of what we're trying to help teachers realize in the land in these Zoom classes. And really, this is more to get you starting to think about, and well, you've all been thinking about it. This is the people who have been thinking about it, but maybe thinking about some of the things we're talking about today and how to pursue those questions more deeply for yourselves, and just kind of glossing over in this time we have what that might actually mean. Here comes my son. I've got 100 teachers on here. So I'll be done soon. Sorry. We're on our first break in a year. So what I want to really convey in the time we have is related to this idea of families and children having a sense of a relationship. And we were, talking about how so often the approach to nature in Canadian institutions is even at places like where there's an environmental stewardship program, there are trails and you're not supposed to leave the trail. And you have to have a very high level of expertise to be able to leave the trail and begin to interact with what's out there. And I think there's a place for that. I absolutely think that there are sites like Evergreen where if everyone goes off trail in a city like Toronto and in Evergreen, they're going to destroy a lot of the stuff that they're trying to work with. But I also think there's a lot of disturbed land in the sort of landscape design world. There's a term called brownfields, and it's used to refer to land that it's basically been desecrated. It's been destroyed. It's whether through pollution or industrial use or just impact of foot and car traffic. And I think I mean, this is most of the land we know, especially in the city of Toronto. And I'm so happy to be talking to teachers in Toronto today. I think there's a lot of, I know there's other teachers in the program as well at OISE from other parts of the world. And but the whole world has been kind of trampled on. The whole world has been, large parts of it have turned into these brownfields. And I want to share this story about a nursery child who was in Krista's class this year, and the Tattle Creek runs underneath the school where they are. It's part of the university, just north of the university, and that creek runs under the university property. And they were describing how the creek runs under the school to a 3-year-old, and he started crying. He was very upset. And I mean, my response to that was, well, my own education, my own Canadian education, made quite sure that kind of my ability as an adult to cry about the buried river has kind of been subverted, I guess, or that's not the right word, suppressed. And what we're talking about now, and this can look very different depending on your context, but we're talking about how we bring that feeling that this child has expressed and center it a little bit more. And in our case, we're looking at how we might take the children as they proceed through that elementary school on a walk up where the creek used to be, and into a relationship with the land at the university, and how they might begin to center all their learning in how they enter into a deep relationships with these sites that have been really have been kind of torn apart and for the most part buried. And there is a woman in the neighborhood who's actually dug up part of this creek. It's in her backyard. And, you know, it's not like we're going to go into everyone's yard and do this. But what I think can happen, and this can happen no matter where you are, is we can begin to ask about what we need to have a relationship with. And depending on the grade, we can also begin to ask about, you know, some of the questions I'm sure some of you are already exploring if you're building gardens, which is where does our food come from? But can also be, where do our clothes come from? So, you know, a lot of the invasive plants that are strangling out the life in this city are apparently good for weaving cloth. And those are the kinds of things I'm hoping we can begin to think about as educators, because and when I was invited to work on this second edition, I think the term that was being passed around was like how it would be indigenized. And my strong feeling was and remains, we can't indigenize it in a book, but we can put a lens to reflect on some of the key principles that the book's been promoting, that says how does this get seen through different Indigenous people's cultural views. And as we're doing that, we're challenged then to enter into some deeper questions and processes that really do challenge us to head in the direction of this word of indigenizing things. So, you know, one of the teachers at this school, even though there were no sugar maples, just before the pandemic struck last year in 2020, you know, went out and tapped a Norway maple in the yard with a bucket and he didn't have tapping equipment. He got a bucket and some kind of hose from Home Depot and just did it himself. And that's the kind of thing I was just so happy to see. That's David Osorio, because as we begin to go out and do things like that, first of all, I don't need to tell teachers you can address everything once you start doing stuff like that. I mean, we can get into geometry and we can get into science, and, you know, doesn't matter, whatever the topic, and it can go into algebra. When I was in high school, I wasn't great at math. I was okay, but I was lucky enough that my dad was a land surveyor, and he would sit down and show me practical applications for some of the high school level math that I was learning. And so as we take children out and begin to ask how we use all this stuff, we're then challenged to ask how we will sustain it. And that's the basic, I mean, you know, if I could only get one thing across in the little time we have today, that would be it. How are we going to use this? And, you know, our elders keep telling us that the plants that are appearing in any given time are showing themselves because they're the ones that we're going to need in that time. And I believe that. I mean, I believe there's an intelligence guiding our world. And so plants like lamb's quarters that most people see as weeds, and they just grow through the cracks beside the road and the sidewalks and so on, used to be a major food source, a major grain. They've gone back to the wild. But if we begin to bring those into the classroom and explore with children the story of that plant, yeah, wild spinach, that, or if we begin to explore, you know, what kind of sap do you get out of a Norway maple, we can get into chemistry. Now, I am aware that, you know, as classroom teachers, you're trained as a teacher and you're not necessarily a chemist. And so we need, one of my main goals is we need to support teachers everywhere with university programs that add knowledge and build kind of answers to those kinds of questions. So then we're no longer addressing abstract questions with children about how we live with the world and sustain it. We're actually asking very, very concrete questions. What actually is the nutritional value of a Norway maple sap? Is it even consumable? We didn't consume it because we didn't know. Somebody's got to answer that question. And I guess what I'd close sort of my opening statement on this with is we're actually taking care of those things and having really deep relationships with them if we're using them and if we're feeling them. And those, not all children will respond this way, but there will be children who have a feeling for the tree, and those children are important. We need to help them process what it means to hammer a hole in a tree. And, you know, that child struggling with the same question that I think Anishinaabe people have addressed in the kinds of ways in which they approach a tree harvesting process. Now we have to be careful because I've seen naturalists sort of on YouTube mimicking poorly grasped Anishinaabe and other ceremonies, and that's not what I'm encouraging at all. And I've seen other people starting to harvest in ways that are ethical without doing that. So these are all big questions, but the essence of what I'm struggling with right now and the research I'm interested in is how teachers actually begin to take children out and prepare for, I would say now, the 22nd century. And what's going to be on our plate if we're going to survive. And those things are all around us. We're not going to be flying them in anymore. They're around us. Haley, I don't know if I'm going way off track or not, and I'm aware that it's 4:36, so I wanted to bounce it back to you, but also give some time for questions from people, because I really do want to hear from teachers.
Yeah, and there are some questions that are coming in that we can definitely talk about now. Yeah, so Hong Liang has a question. I notice a sense of spirituality mentioned in the 4 branches, which we have talked about being connected to inquiry and engagement. How do we shift knowledge building to heart-based knowledge building? What is the best way to introduce the concept of spirit to young children and support them to develop spiritual relationships with the natural world?
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge for me as well. So we have a secular humanist system for the most part. Even the Catholic system, as far as I've sort of been exposed to it, tends to have, you know, aside from a kind of a Catholic side to the education, a lot of the ongoing instruction has a secular humanist kind of feel to it, because it's coming through in Ontario anyway, the Ontario curriculum. I think it's not a question I'm comfortable answering alone, but I think the answer for me lies in stories. And Susan Dion has done wonderful work, the TDSB, sort of in the past 20 years, bringing Indigenous resources and perspectives and people into an exploration of how they can relate to public schools and another school board as well. And what they were finding was that one teacher said this really well. It stuck in my head in the report. She was talking about how she was reading a creation story from, I believe it was Anishinaabe, but it could have been another one. And she realized her first impulse at the end of it, because she has to do an activity, was to get the children to write their own version of a creation story. And of this, you know, or to, and she realized, she caught herself and she said, well, if I were to read the Quran or the Bible or the Hindu Vedas in a classroom, first of all, could I do that without having catching all kinds of flack? Secondly, would I then proceed to encourage the children to write their own Bible or Hindu scripture? And the answer, of course, is a resounding no. And so I had to ask myself, first of all, what kind of, so my family is partly Anishinaabe, but we're the Scottish Métis, basically. And I'm not on our homeland territory. I grew up in Ontario, but we're from Manitoba. So I had to ask myself, how could I tell an Anishinaabe story in the classroom? But there are stories we can tell. I would say there's a really big question about other traditions. I think they do belong. I think stories from those traditions do belong in children's public education. And I think we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we sort of started banning all of it. There's profound human knowledge embedded in those stories. There's also clear references to natural laws that correspond with Indigenous laws. Anishinaabe and Nakanagewin is embedded in natural laws and sacred laws, these higher levels of law or more profound levels of law. And if we're not referencing those, then we're reproducing a kind of a, for me, and not everyone has to, take this, agree with this, but for me, we're addressing a much reduced perspective on the natural world around us. The natural world around us, if we're really going to have a deep relationship and have a deep sense of place, it's important at the very least to understand that it's got some kind of soul, some kind of spirit, and there's a distinction between those two terms. And in every tradition, that distinction is clear. That there are different levels of ontological reality to the place we're in. So having a relationship and a reciprocal relationship with the place I'm in, it does. And a child crying because the river's been buried, for me, is a clear sign that the child feels it in their heart. I mean, that's just common sense. And so what I decided was I would tell the Seven Fires prophecy of the Anishinaabe Nation, because it was published by respected elders. Now, whether everyone agreed with that decision, I'm not sure. But it was published, and it was also, I've heard it and sort of taken it in over a period of some decades. And it was a prophecy that talks about the time we're in. So the sixth and seventh fire are about the time that we're in. And it's something that I began telling to children on the land. And I quickly found that a lot of the pressure was off of me, because the story itself speaks for itself, and it gives the listener a sense that we are at we're at a major crossroads, and that if we're going to begin to restore the world around us, we've got to operate on a different basis. And I think it's up to the children to begin exploring what that means. But of course, in all the classes that I work with, unless I go into Wandering Spirit, most of the kids are non-Indigenous. Usually there's one Native kid in each class. That's been my general experience. And they may be hidden and may not even be known to be Indigenous until we sort of tease it out. But once that story is told, the children start to identify within their own traditions and cultures some similar stories. So it's not about, let's tell everyone an Anishinaabe story and let's burn some sweetgrass and like now you're all going to play in Indian is the term we used to use, pretendians. We don't want that. But at the same time, children need to come into a relationship with Anishinaabe traditions and prophecies, because that's the time we're in. And Anishinaabe people are waiting to renew those covenants, I believe, with the rest of the people who have arrived here, and they've been neglected for a long time. So when I tell that story, what the story is about is how people strayed further and further from their original instructions, about how to live in reciprocity with the world and with each other and with the creator and creation. And as we've gone further from that, there's been more and more destruction. When children hear it, you know, it's pretty amazing what comes up, because now I've had some pretty articulate kids in some of the contexts I've been in, but they've made connections within their own tradition, and you can find them. So, you know, even a secular Jewish person may be able to see the value of the tradition within their own culture that was held of the Jubilee, and that was a way of taking care of the land and ensuring that it heals from overuse. There are ways in every culture of reflecting natural laws. Yeah, so I'm kind of rambling on, but to answer your question, it's really important, and it's hard to convey when we're not out on the land, that we actually need to slow down, stop, and begin to answer to a different kind of law. And it's not to say that we should be against human laws, but our elders and traditional people and scholars, M.A. Craft is an Anishinaabe legal scholar, and she terms it this way. There's the human law, level of human law, and then there's natural laws that are higher than that, or more anterior to human law, and then there's sacred laws that inform those. Those are the ones that are unalterable. And children can understand that concept. And if we're able to sit down with them and slow down and say, you can still be, it's not all about nature. We're not all nature people, right? We're not all environmentalists or farmers. But if we can slow down and stop and say our instructions need to come from the natural world, that will determine how we grow different kinds of administrators and lawyers and scientists and engineers and artists and so on. Because the way we're training, this is my personal belief and experience in school, is the way we are trained and the way we're training humans is to kind of satisfy our own desires and egos, but not to be answerable to more profound principles. And everyone knows that, who's an environmentalist, certainly. It's like, why can't we do this? And that's, I just think and David Osorio, who's in this picture, he's on the left with the beard in the picture on the right, is part of his work. He's really looking at stories and how storytelling with children is a way of connecting with this sense of relationship, with kinship with things, and with the natural world. It's really hard to convey, and I know we have like 13 minutes. I'm staring at this thing. Watching it race by. Haley, did you have anything to add to that? This is us slowing down and stopping and sitting outside and telling stories.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Doug. I was thinking I could just take a moment to share the story of the land at the front of the school as a part of this conversation, and then people can pop any more questions that they have, or you can jump in to add to that conversation as well. So yeah, and thinking about what Doug already shared, you know, the lab school, in response to reading the writing from Doug on breathing with the world and on reciprocity, really started to think about how the actions that we take with children are not just one-off acts of stewardship that, yes, are still important. You know, yes, planting a tree is a great act, but how do we form deeper, more meaningful relationships to that tree and to that land and to that experience itself? So this is just a little story that some of you may have heard already, but about the land that is outside of the laboratory school. And about 3 years ago, leading up to Earth Day, an activity that was often done during Earth Day with the students at the lab school was planting pansies, which is beautiful, and the kids get their hands dirty and they work together. But in reading about reciprocity, we sort of challenged, like, well, what's the point of that? Like, how is that creating relationship? And so how do we make that more meaningful? And so what happened is a beginning of a conversation with how we connect ourselves as a staff, as well as the students, to the land that is just outside of the school. And so you can see this picture is of JK students actually digging up hostas that were then passed on to families at the school. So again, connecting to this idea of, even though these aren't invasive, but we're not just throwing them out, because they still are plant life. But digging those up, doing it and asking for permission later. So U of T groundskeeping wasn't too happy about that, but oh well, we did it anyway. And working with Doug and working with an Indigenous gardener to replant this area with local native species, as well as with medicines. And so you can see in the next slide, this is that same area sort of taken from a different angle, and you can see that there's now sweet grass. This is after the summer season. This is the very beginning of the year, and this is us sort of telling the principal of the lab school to stick his face in the sweet grass, because if you've never smelled sweet grass, you're missing out. Like, so all the staff smelled the sweet grass and talked about our relationship to this land outside the school. And actually, you can see one of the teachers is reading a section of Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, talking about reciprocity. This space and that sage actually has been transplanted from an area that Doug spends a lot of time and works on along the Humber River. So Doug, you helped us bring that sage as well to the school and replant it there.
There's a lot of stuff that this is just one small section of the front, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we moved in, and that was, in any group of people, and this includes children, there's probably, of a class, there's probably one that really wants to be in the garden doing gardening. That's been my experience. But it wasn't just about putting plants in and digging plants. It was also, Richard, the principal, had a deep connection to the hostas and the process that was involved in putting the hostas in there. And so, for me, we were just going to tear them out, but we had to think about how everyone's affected in different ways, and come up with a way for finding out who really would want those, and taking care of things in a wider kind of community. And that, I think, is part of the difference in the approach that we're promoting through this resource. It's absolutely connecting with and having kinship with everything and everyone who's got a relationship with this. And in a city like Toronto, we're gonna come across multiple relationships in multiple directions, and so any activity outside is absolutely going to it's going to bring up opportunities we can't even begin to imagine until we start doing it. What discourages us is often the bureaucracy. Haley mentioned we just did it and asked for forgiveness later. But dealing with a bureaucracy can also be a learning experience, right? That could be your inquiry. It could be that is actually what the children are learning about, and it's not, the planting is kind of, it's a great thing to do, but it may not even be the main lesson. I really want to stress that. Like, once we start going outside of the box, all kinds of things come up, and it's having the courage, and I think also the network to support that, because if you're taking risks by yourself as a teacher in a school where no one else is really inclined to do so, you need a network of people who are going to sort of support. And I think that there is a resource person, Chris Metropolis, on here today, who could probably speak to the TDSB's recently approved motion to support outdoor learning. And it could also be a way of setting up more bureaucracy. But I think the intent behind it is nevertheless going to ultimately help teachers network and be a part of getting outside and talking with other teachers about it. And natural curiosity, of course, is a good resource for that. Their goal is to support that for teachers. Are there questions, other questions? I'm just going and looking.
Yeah, the one last thing I wanted to say about that, I think, Doug, which is powerful, is that I know Krista has been harvesting some of these medicines. So in terms of reciprocity, I know she's been able to, I haven't been at the school obviously because of COVID, but she's been able, there's the opportunity to now offer that when we work with Indigenous community members or Indigenous partners or Indigenous elders, able to offer that medicine in reciprocity that was grown and planted by the staff and the students as sort of a part of this process of relationship and reciprocity in the land.
Yeah, and the other great thing about when we're talking about reciprocity, yes, if you want to use cedar for the flu, it's a great medicine for that, but you want to plant cedars, so there's obvious stuff. But it's also about it, and I imagine this will be relevant for a lot of the people listening today. The groundskeepers or the maintenance people in your school. I mean, I have a relationship with a school on the street I'm living on, and those guys who take care of the grounds can be a major barrier or a major asset. And I think what often we feel, what sort of stalls us is, as adults, we're trying to navigate, the union or the just the sensitivities around who does what. What if the children were somehow engaged in the process? What if the children are writing letters to the groundskeepers and saying, we want to grow medicines, and then they're copying the principle? I mean, you can make it a learning activity, and it's got a lot more direct impact and meaning than writing a letter to the Prime Minister. I'm sorry, but he's probably not going to read it. So how do children navigate and demonstrate those ways of having influence in the world directly, because we've all done that as kids in school and as teachers, where we maybe put together a petition and somebody gets back to us, but ultimately you're not going to bend the ears of power too much. But there are small powers all around us, and we can really begin to develop good relationships with the place we're in. And that's really what this document's all about. So we're deeply rooted, we're feeling it in our heart, we're deeply rooted, and we're actually having a relationship with the caretaker. I mean, my relationship with my school caretaker as a kid was, he's a spooky guy who kind of talks to you on the side. And I don't know if he was good or bad guy, but he was kind of, everyone was scared of him. But he's part of your community, or she. A lot of them seem to be he's in my experience. So how do we develop relationships with that? How do we navigate the fears that parents and that administrators have about that relationship with an adult who hasn't been vetted one way or another? I don't know if groundskeepers and maintenance people, they probably do have to do all the same kinds of background checks as everyone else. But how do we that raises questions that we can explore with our children about safety and strangers and safe context and so on. It's just endless. It goes on and on. So I encourage you to dig down right where you are, and I hope we can keep these networks alive. I'm really grateful to Haley and her team at Natural Curiosity, and for people like Hillary and Chris for the work they do, because over time we are absolutely going to need to get into the land with the children, because it's how they're going to survive. They need this knowledge. And there's a lot of knowledge coming. It's not just food, it's medicine. There's a lot of important medicines that need to be shared and have been held in secret by Indigenous people, because they're afraid of people abusing things. You have no idea how much medicine there is and how much good can be done by it. So thanks for that. I better stop because it's it's getting to be 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So I just want to pop in here before people start to log off that we do have a 20% discount code for anybody who has attended this workshop for purchasing Natural Curiosity. So there's a link there for you, and then I can pass it off to you, Hillary, to wrap us up.
A huge thank you to both of you. What an interesting conversation. I really get feeling like we've covered so much bases, and we've learned so much. And I love that you've ended on a very practical note, Doug. That idea, I've always been a firm believer in developing a relationship with your school caretaker and bringing the occasional coffee and maybe a little gift at Christmas. But actually, you're right. I completely missed the point. It's about having the children develop the relationship with the caretaker, letting the caretaker know that the children value the work that's done, and working in partnership with that caretaker. Because you're absolutely right. The caretaker is key to getting a vibrant school ground in place to help support children learning on the land. So, so much great, wonderful stories and wonderful advice. So I'm just so pleased with this webinar. Thank you so much. If I can ask everybody to join me in thanking both Haley and Doug for their time today. And I'm hoping that we can have you back again next year, maybe to continue the conversation.